Hello, all. I'm Claire Michael. I'm a freshman at Marysville Getchell High School and the co-founder of Future Voters Club. We are a bipartisan club that focuses on media literacy as well as civil discourse. We'll continue to allow people to trickle in, but to be respectful to all of your time, we wanted to get started. So I'm so excited that all of you could join us here today, and thank you to Councilman Jared Mead and Nate Nehring for being here as well. A couple of months ago, Snohomish County Council members Nate Nehring and Jared Mead published an op-ed that really resonated with the people of our community. In their article, the council members pointed out how the media, instead of helping us find common ground, so often drives us further and further apart. This polarization not only becomes an obstacle to making democracy work, but it can also often lead to dehumanizing and even attacking those who think differently from us. The council members went on to stress the importance of recognizing each person's humanity and striving to understand different points of view. The future of our community and our democracy depends on how seriously we take this message. I'd like to give the council members a couple minutes to introduce themselves, talk about why they think this conversation is important, as well as give an overview of the op-ed. And as an introductory question, how do you guys define civil discourse? What does it look like to you?
You want to go for it, Nate?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, Jared, and thank you, Claire. Really appreciate you pulling all this together and moderating tonight. So thank you so much for your role in that. And then, of course, thanks to the district and all the students who are attending and participating. This is one of my favorite things to do as a council member, is to get out and talk with community members about important issues. And it's even better when I get to talk with students. And so really love this opportunity. And Jared and I have had the chance, we'll probably talk a little bit about this, but over the last couple of days, we were invited by Mr. Natterstad to speak in his classes. And so got to interact with quite a few of you, and I know both of us really enjoyed that. But my name is Nate Nehring. As Claire mentioned, I'm a Snohomish County Council member. I represent District 1, which is the northern part of Snohomish County, and that's the cities of Marysville, Arlington, Stanwood, Granite Falls, and Darrington. I've been on the county council since 2017. My wife and I were both born and raised in Marysville, went to Marysville Getchell High School, and graduated from there. And we now live in Arlington with our two young children. We've got a daughter who's 2.5 and a son who's 1. And really enjoy my work on the county council and getting to work with Jared and all of the other council members. And we've got a lot of great things happening. And I think the importance of our discussion tonight can't be underestimated when we're talking about civil discourse and what to do about media bias and all those sorts of things. And so I'm really looking forward to our discussion tonight. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jared.
Thanks, Nate. And I'm going to echo what Nate just said about Claire, and thanking you for taking the initiative. And not only with the club that you started, the Future Voters Club, I think that's incredible. I had not heard about it before I met you. I must have been a couple of days ago. And so that's something that you should be really proud of. And that's an exciting feat for someone in high school to take on. So thank you for doing that, as well as putting this together. My name is Jared Mead. I'm a Snohomish County Council member as well. I represent District 1 or District 4, Nate's District 1. I represent District 4, which is more of the South County, Mill Creek, Bothell, Briar, Mountain Lake Terrace, and some unincorporated county. I joined the county council in April, so I'm heading up on my first year on the county council. But before that, I served as a Mill Creek City Council member. That was in 2017. And then I also, for the last 2 years before I was appointed to the Snohomish County Council, represented the 44th legislative district in the Washington State House of Representatives. So I've served in a multitude of various government positions at the local level, where it's a city, in the state government, and now in the county council. So that perspective has given me some insight on how different conversations and different parties and different perspectives work at various levels in the government, which has been pretty eye-opening for me over these last handful of years. Just a little background on myself before we get into that great first opening question. I was also born and raised here in Snohomish County, down in the south part. I'm a proud product of these public schools as well. I graduated from Jackson High School. And my wife and I own our house down here just outside of Mill Creek. We have 2 little kids. We have a 2-year-old, I have a 2-year-old son named Callan, and we have a 3.5-week-old. So you can see the rings in my eyes from that. Right now, the baby is quiet, but you might hear her at some point here in the nighttime. And like Nate said, I'm really excited about this type of conversation. And a little bit about kind of how the op-ed that sparked this conversation came about. Nate and I have known each other for a few years, since before I was appointed to the county council, and we've had the opportunity to work with each other a couple of times here and there when I was in the legislature on things like his RAP program, which is a regional apprentice program, which was something that in the legislature I used my position to try to help secure some funding for. So we had the opportunity to work a little bit together, but I didn't really get to know him until this past year. But when I joined the county council, we started to get to know each other a little bit better on a personal level. We have kids the same age. We grew up here in Snohomish County. Our wives are both public school teachers. We both care a lot about our community, all those things. Obviously, there's a lot of political policy disagreements that we have and have had over the last year or so, but we haven't ever let that get in the way of us trying to work through some of those things and find things that we can work together on, which we have. And we've had a lot of success in a handful of policies that maybe we'll end up talking about throughout the night. But what ended up happening in January in Washington, D.C. and the riots, and then seeing the fallout with the different political parties and how the different medias were running those stories, and what ended up happening to conversations in the community, that was really starting to tear at us. And I think I still haven't found that text, Nate, but I remember he texted me that day and said something along the lines of, this is tragic. What kind of a world are we raising our kids in right now, where not only can something like this fester and then end up happening, but the fallout and the discourse and the way that we as a community are reacting and responding to that. And I said, funny that you should say that. I just started writing because on that same day, I was getting a little emotional. I wanted to just put some stuff down on paper. So would you be interested in co-writing something? He said, absolutely. And we did a back and forth for about a day or two before we landed on some language that we agreed on. And I mean, he's a Republican, I'm a Democrat. We come from pretty different perspectives when it comes to that. So for us to be able to find this common ground and really connect on some type of language and perspective, I think was surprising to me, that how quickly and that happened. But then we sent it in and the Herald posted it, and then we started to get some responses in the community, and it was pretty overwhelming and positive. And it's something that Claire even referenced. And that's why we're doing this here, and why we've done a lot of school visits that we've done, and met with the Rotary Club even earlier this morning. And so it was clear that the community really resonated with that kind of message of, how do we get back to a place where we can at least start talking to each other again, even if we disagree. And that was something that was inspiring. And Nate and I connected on that and said, let's accept every invitation. If there's a group of folks, no matter where, want us to come talk about that, let's do that. And that's kind of where this has all come from. So I'm really excited to kind of get this conversation on a bigger scale, and do this town hall and answer questions and have this conversation with the community. I do also want to address that really good first question that Claire posed, but I've been talking for a long time and my mouth is getting dry. So I would wonder if Nate would want to try to tackle that question of what we even mean by civil discourse. And then I'll jump in after I drink some water.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jared. And I'm glad we're starting with this question, because it's a really important topic, and probably good that we all are on the same page with what we're talking about. So when I think about civic discourse, basically in a simplified way, I think of the ability to talk with one another in a respectful way about, the important issues of the day, even if we disagree. And so, you can pick your issue, but, take two people who are on opposite sides of it. And I think civil discourse is when those two people are able to have, a respectful, kind conversation with one another about that issue. So I can think, for example, there are times on the Snohomish County Council where Jared and I are on opposite sides of an issue. But I really appreciate that I can always pick up the phone and call Jared and get his perspective on the issue. And it helps me learn a little bit more and informs me. And maybe I learned something that I hadn't considered before. And I would consider that maybe an example of civic discourse.
And for me, I would agree with a lot of what Nate just said. And what I would add to at least the definition of civil discourse is that I think sometimes it can mean different things to different people, depending on background and culture, and even just general understanding of the word and how it's been introduced to them in their life, or the words. And so civil discourse to me is really about approaching conversations with a good heart and in good faith. And trying to give the benefit of the doubt to the person that you're talking to, and make them prove to you that they're trying to do something for nefarious reasons. Assume that they are doing things in good faith and that they might just have a different perspective, and that they're not challenging you just to take you down or just to earn some points, but that maybe they truly do just have something that perspective you don't, or know something you don't, and maybe you can learn something from them. And that won't always be the case. Of course, there are people who do want to tear people down, and of course, there are people that don't approach conversations in good faith. But by and large, my experience is that when you approach conversations like that, you tend to be right, and the conversations tend to go a lot smoother, and you can learn from people. But I think it's also important to highlight kind of what I opened that with, which is that different people maybe communicate differently, and different cultures communicate differently. Some people uh, will be louder, speak louder. Some people are more expressive with their hands and with their gestures. Some people use different language. Some people grew up and curse more. Some people are very strict about not cursing. And I think it's important for us to understand that we have to meet people where they are in their conversations. And just because somebody is using a louder tone, or more expressive, or they get more emotional, doesn't necessarily mean that they're approaching a conversation in bad faith, or they're trying to take you down, or all of those negative things. Sometimes that's how they express themselves. And it, even on a cultural level, I think that's sometimes where we run into trouble in these types of conversations, because even some cultures communicate differently. And I think that's something important when we're talking about civil discourse. That's why I'm glad that we opened up with this first question, is to talk about and kind of highlight what we mean when we talk about civil discourse, and that it's not necessarily you need to be calm and quiet and you need to be polite, because that's not how everybody communicates. But if we are operating in good faith, and we are approaching conversations with a good heart, and with the assumption that we're not trying to do wrong and that they're not trying to do wrong, I think that's what I mean. And I think that's what Nate means by civil discourse. I think that's where we need to try to get to as a community.
Thank you both. I think those were amazing answers. And for audience members, you are able to ask questions. I think there should be in your top left corner a little Q&A button where you're able to ask questions. Our next question we have lined up is, because of the internet's dehumanizing nature, or at least its ability to disassociate our actions with their effects on others, as well as its ability to create echo chambers of one idea, how do you think we can change this pattern and use the internet to encourage civil discourse?
Yeah, great question. I would also just mention before getting to the question, and I know we mentioned this to the classes we've been at the last 2 days, feel free to ask any questions of Jared and I know both of us are open to anything. So whether it's about the op-ed, or if you're interested in something in county government, or really anything, feel free to include that as a question. But I really appreciate this question, Claire. I think it's a really good one. The internet and social media in particular, and we probably all are aware of this to some extent, but has a lot of benefits, but it's also got a lot of downsides as well. And so when I think of the benefits of the internet and the ability to interact with one another online, I think of a lot of different efforts, like raising awareness for important issues that we might not otherwise know about. Being able to connect with people who we might not otherwise be able to talk with in person. And so there's a lot of really great things that come from social media and from the internet, and from the ability to interact with others behind the keyboard without having to be face to face. But as kind of the question gets at, there's a lot of downsides as well. I think that if you go on Facebook or Twitter or the comment section of various newspapers, you'll see a lot of trolling on any given post or issue. And I think people, when they're behind a keyboard as opposed to talking with somebody face to face, they lose a little bit of the maybe respect for the other person, or the humanization of the other person. And I think that's really unfortunate. And so, I don't think I have the answer for how to fix that. But one of the things that I've tried to do when I'm interacting on social media, or before I post something, or before I comment something, I always try to think, what I say, what I'm writing to somebody, if I were face to face with them in person, and how would that be received? Because I think, a lot of times it's a lot easier for us to let tensions boil over when we're behind a screen. But I think that's really important to try to put ourselves through a test like that, to see if it's really appropriate to post something or to comment something. And so I think all of us can kind of lead by example on this when we're posting on social media or other places on the internet, of just being a little bit more respectful, even when there's disagreement. And I think when one of us does that, it leads to others doing it, and it can have a positive domino effect. So those are my initial thoughts on it.
And I agree with most of what Nate just said. I don't want to repeat too much of it. The one thing that I would add is that the internet and social media, of course, there's so much good that it's brought, all these new ideas, et cetera, and all of the various things that Nate just listed off. But one of the other downsides is that it's so much easier now to find a place, on the internet where everyone around you agrees with you, and I'm talking thousands and thousands of people all could have these same ideas, and you can sit in your bubble and feel very comfortable and be reinforced of your worldview, and assume that everyone believes exactly what you think because you post something on social media and someone in your Washington, someone in New York, someone in Florida is commenting on that and saying, hey, I agree the same thing, gives you the heart emoji and says, great job, you're totally right. And you could assume, and it'd be very easy to assume that you've got the mainstream opinion when you post things on social media, because that's the way that social media is geared, is to funnel people that agree and have similar ideas to the same place and advertise to them, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we have to be intentional about being intellectually curious. We have to be intentional about challenging our own ideas and our own preconceived worldviews and going outside of our comfort zone and maybe looking at different types of media, maybe intentionally talking to someone who isn't going to agree with you on something, to see why, and not just assume it's because they're a bad person, which is a lot of times what happens when you are reinforced with your worldview for a long enough by sitting on the internet. And so that's the one thing that I would add to what Nate was saying.
Thank you. I think our next question that we have here is, what do you think the effect will be on my generation entering politics into such a partisan and tense climate on our future mindsets when we participate in the future? More directly, I guess.
This was a question that Nate and I actually had in one of the classroom visits that we had earlier this week as well, and it really impacted me enough that it was something that it stuck with me for a day or two, and I actually posted about it on social media, because that's such a critical question. Right now we're in a point where it feels like the ability for us to converse with each other in these kind of thoughtful, good faith ways has been diminishing by year based on the rhetoric from politicians at the highest level for the most part. And the fact that a student was asking that question when we were visiting a class talking about this was really impactful, because one, that means that students are thinking about this. Young people are thinking about the way in which we speak to each other, and what the future looks like if we aren't able to speak to each other, if we have differing opinions. I know that one of the concerns from some of the students throughout our conversations were, family members disowning each other, or not being able to have friends who you've known for the last 12, 13 years, but you're not friends anymore because you have these disagreements. And one of the girls was talking about a specific example of a project that she was working on. It had nothing to do with politics or political views, but because her and her assigned partner had differing views on something unrelated to the project, it made it really difficult for them to even have conversations about this project, which again had nothing to do with their disagreements. And so I think it's important that in our school system as well, we're teaching young people that it's all right to have differing opinions. It's all right to have different perspectives, and we all should. And that's how the world stays interesting. And as long as we're approaching these conversations with people who we have different opinions from in good faith, again, and giving them the benefit of the doubt that they might be good people that just think differently than us, you're going to be able to look through those a lot easier and work on a project that, again, is unrelated to the things that you're disagreeing about, and still have a good work product. And I think that's something that can be used in politics, in your everyday work life, in your school life. And so I'm excited about that question, and I'm excited that young people are actually asking those questions and thinking about those things, because it's so important to the future, and the future generations are the ones that are going to be able to kind of put us back on track as far as this civil discourse conversation goes. So that's a great question.
Yeah, thanks. And I'd agree with a lot of what Jared said. The question we got in the classroom, which was really similar to this, also stuck with me. And I think it's really sad to think about the hyper partisan climate that we have, or that we see on the news, really being a turnoff to young people getting involved with politics. That doesn't just mean running for office, but just being interested in issues that are affecting their community. And I think that's really unfortunate. Obviously, we'd probably all on this call agree that we need more young people in politics and not less. There are a lot of various groups which are underrepresented in government, but I think one of them is young people. And maybe a little bit later we'll get to talk, but Jared is actually working on a youth advisory council for Snohomish County, which we haven't historically had. And I think that's a great opportunity for young people to get involved in government. But, to get back to the question, I think if we don't get away from just this hyper-partisan environment, we're going to lose, young people's interests in getting involved civically. And we really need that. And so the more that we can just focus on the issues and be civil with each other, I think the better chance we have of getting more people who are active and engaged in issues that are affecting their community. And so, again, I would say we can all, each and every one of us has a little bit of a responsibility in that, and just by leading an example of what we'd like to see.
Thank you both. So we have a question from Ian Nelson, I believe. So it's a two-part question. How might we make opportunities for civil discourse more accessible to the general public? And have any of you three seen spaces for people of diverse perspectives to have civil discourse?
Yeah, really good question. Thank you for asking that, Ian. So I can think of maybe a couple of examples off the top of my head. The first one that actually comes to mind is the club that Claire started. So maybe, Claire, if you feel comfortable, you could give a brief overview of that club, because that sounds like a really great opportunity in the school to be able to have, an opportunity for civil discourse with your fellow students. I was invited one time to participate in an event, and I want to say it was called Better Angels, and it was hosted by a group, and I think they took like 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans, and they brought us all together and had us listen to each other's perspectives on various issues. And what we came to realize at the end of the event was how much closer together we are in thought on a lot of these things. Whereas, if you just paid attention to the media, you'd think we're so far apart and there was no way to find any common ground. So I think that was really interesting. If you're interested, I'd encourage you to Google the Better Angels, I think is the name of the organization. So those are a couple examples that come to mind. But I think your question is a really good one, because we do need more opportunities for civil discourse, whether it's in our schools or in our government. At the Snohomish County Council, every meeting we have has an opportunity for public comment, but you don't really have the opportunity to interact with other members of the community at that time. So it would be really cool if we had like a forum where people could come and talk about important issues and be able to interact with one another and learn from one another.
Yeah, and I think the board, Nate mentioned in one of the previous questions, the opportunity that I'm working on right now is to create a youth advisory board, which is, us kind of going out and trying as a county government, trying to invite youth, specifically in this case, to the table to have this kind of civil discourse conversation, to say, hey, what do you think matters to government? How do you feel about these different policy issues we're working on? Or do you have other ideas that we're not thinking about that youth perspective can give? Those types of things. So I think that some of it is also on us as government leaders to be intentional about reaching out and asking for feedback and asking for these conversations and being accessible. I know Nate does a good job of being accessible on social media. I try to do a good job of being accessible on social media and through my emails and in my responses, and trying to get back to people as quickly as possible and have these opportunities to go out and get coffee with constituents who have concerns or just want to talk about issues. So I think a lot of it is also on our government officials to be accessible and to create opportunities and create space for those diverse opinions that you're referencing. But I, like Nate, would be really interested if Claire would be willing, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you would be willing to talk about this Future Voters Club that she created, because that's an exact example of kind of it's coming naturally from from the community, and it's a space to talk about these types of things. So you could say no, Claire, if you want to, or yeah, you can jump in and talk through that if you'd like.
Yeah, so I started this club with one of my friends from middle school, and the impetus was really, we had seen how kind of this partisan environment was affecting us as teenagers, and because I think particularly of social media more than other generations previously, we almost couldn't escape politics because it was always there on your timelines or when you opened your phone. And so I think the intention was really just to start a dialogue and make a choice to connect with our peers. And we'd always be high school students first. And I think part of the thing is, like you guys said in the op-ed, is just seeing each other's humanity and having that inherent respect. And so yeah, it's the whole point to just kind of have an opportunity. We just talk about we've gone over international, state, and local, and then also national topics, and we just have we generally limit to like 30 minutes discussions on an issue. And then also for specific programs, I think there's a program ran through Harvard Innovation Labs that pairs people up of different perspectives to have conversations. And then there's another program, I think it's called Mismatch, but I think that's one's more specifically geared towards students. It's kind of a similar thing. It's like little mini Zoom meetings with, I think, 3 or 5 people who you take like a political leaning survey beforehand. They kind of match you up based on that. And then we have our next question from Kathy Christensen. How can we do a better job of including POC in these important issues and really listen to what they say and feel?
That's a great question, Kathy. So I think it's a little bit of a similar way to the answer that I just gave about trying to include people with diverse opinions. We need to do a good job as elected officials, as government leaders, to be intentional about kind of making these spaces. And even earlier in the year, I think it must have been late last year, actually, we passed an ordinance that opened up. We have a regional law and justice council, and it was during the discussions over the summer of social justice and law enforcement and reforms in that area. And we thought it would be a good idea. This regional law and justice council is made up of mainly just elected officials, county elected officials, and law enforcement officials throughout the county. And there's no opportunities for people from the public to be on that board to give input. It's like 22 or 23 members on there. And the idea that I had was, well, why don't we make some space for folks from the community, particularly from marginalized groups in the community, to join this board and give their perspective in these really important and really relevant topical conversations around law and justice generally in the county. And the council, I worked with Nate and the rest of the county council members, and we passed that on a 5-0 vote, bipartisan vote that opened up. So now the Regional Law and Justice Council, as of, I think it must have been last month, Nate, maybe it was even in this month, March, we finalized the appointees, and we appointed 7 members from the community, all from marginalized perspectives throughout the community on this board now. So for our next Law and Justice Regional Council meeting, which will be held sometime in this next month, we'll have about 30 members on that board now instead of the 22 or 23, and it'll be made up of a large amount of members of the community and mainly people of color on the board, to be able to give these perspectives when it comes to law and justice. And so that's an example of the government kind of reaching out and saying, we need to step over and make some space and maybe out of that comfort zone in our kind of like government law enforcement bubble, and say, well, why don't we invite the community in an official capacity to come give their advice and their perspective. So I think a lot of it can be intentional and should be intentional with our government leaders.
Yeah, and I think Jared said it best about being intentional about including groups which maybe in previous situations haven't had their voices heard. And certainly, the recent events with law enforcement and race are a really important one where we need to make sure that we're listening to all different perspectives from different groups. But I think all issues in general, we should try to make sure that people have access to being able to have their voices heard, in public events that are going on with their government. And so being intentional about including people and encouraging people to participate, I think is really good. And another thing, I think, as elected officials, and not just in politics, I think community leaders as well, being intentional about going out and speaking with different groups who maybe you typically wouldn't go and speak with. And I think, accepting any invitation to come and have a discussion and listen and learn from different perspectives is only a good thing.
That's great. Our next question is from Karen Crowley. To what extent does our two-party system contribute to our polarization? What might be an alternative approach?
Yeah, good question. So certainly having a two-party system does, I think, contribute to some of the polarization we see, although there has to be more to it than that because things haven't always been so hyper-polarized like they are right now. I think, having a two-party system and having different political parties which espouse different, values or opinions on various issues is important. But I don't know that we, the amount of what's the word I'm looking for? Disrespect, maybe, or the lack of ability to come together and have civil discourse with different parties is really mainly the issue. I think it's good that people have different perspectives on things, and so I don't think that's the issue. We don't want to get rid of that. But what we want to do is find a way that people with different perspectives who disagree on things can come together and have civil conversations and learn from each other and listen to each other on those. So what might be an alternative approach? I don't know that we're going to get rid of a two-party system anytime soon. So I'm not sure about an alternative approach. I'd be really open to hearing ideas, but I think the important thing, like I said, is seeing, even when people disagree, how can we bring them together to have those important conversations?
And I agree with Nate's assessment on the two-party system and maybe the strengths of it and the fact that it's been around for as long as it has. And I don't know that necessarily will be something that changes too drastically anytime soon. But I also think that it does play a really heavy role when you combine that with some of the new pressures in the world that we have today that have not existed previously, like some of the things we've talked about, social media and the internet age and the news media, this particularly the mainstream medias, the CNNs and the Fox Newses of the world. So those things combined with the two-party system, combined with something that I've done a lot of reading on over the last few years in the tribalism that's deep embedded in human psychology generally. We all have this yearning as human beings to want to be a part of something, to want to be a part of a tribe. Human beings that worked together survived, and that gene and that trait have perpetuated up until the humans beings that we are today. So we all want to be a part of a group. It feels good to be a part of a group and to support your group and your tribe. But the problem is when you combine that, you overlay that with this two-party system, and then the radicalization that's been occurring with social media and echo chambers, like I referenced earlier, where you could have a fringe idea here in Washington State and only have 10 human beings in Washington State actually agree with you, but you could think 10,000 people agree with you if you post it online, because everyone in the world, everyone in the country can see that and interact with that. I think when you combined all of those things, that's when we get to this point where the two-party system is now really hyper dividing us. And so I think what it's going to take in this like alternative, maybe it's not an alternative to the actual government system, but the alternative is and I'll drive this home until I'm unelected for it, is trying to be intellectually curious, is trying to give the benefit of the doubt to the person that you're talking to and make them prove to you that they're a bad person instead of assuming it and making them prove to you that they're a good person. When I talk to Nate about policies, and we disagree on a lot. There's been a lot. If you go look at our voting records over this last year, there's been plenty of 3-2 votes that I've lost, and he's been on the other side of a 3-2 vote. There's been plenty of times where we disagree, but I don't think I can compartmentalize that as he has a different perspective than I do on this issue. And I can now talk to him about this issue and work on early learning, which is something we both care very deeply about with young kids, and having espouses in the education system. So we talk through that, and we can, and I can assume that when he says, actually, I'd like to move a little bit of that funding over to this part instead of this part. And I said, that's not what I had in mind. I don't think it's because he's a bad person that's trying to tear me down and he's a Republican, so I'm just going to move on. I wonder why someone who I respect as a human is saying that. Let me think about it and talk to him about it. I think that's what we need a little bit more of. And we're getting closer. I think we're getting to a precipice where enough people are like Claire and students, young students who are looking at what social media is doing to them and their friends and their families, and looking at what this partisan divide is resulting in. I think enough people, based on the responses that Nate and I even got from the op-ed that we did, I think there's enough people out there that are starting to say, okay, look, I know I want to be a part of this team and this tribe, and I know I really do care about these values in the blue side or these values in the red side, but I don't think that that person is the devil, like maybe this news source is trying to make me think that they are, or like this social media post might make me think that they are, or like this meme might make me think that they are. So I think it's going to be a lot of the ownership is going to be on us as humans in the society to tell each other it's okay to think differently. And I assume that when you're telling me something that I disagree with, it's just because you have a different perspective. It's not because you're trying to tear me down or you have no soul or you don't care about XYZ. I think that's what it's going to have to be is us as a community making that intentional decision to be more curious.
I think that's great. Our next question comes from an anonymous participant. How do you feel about the increase in more radical opinions on all sides of the political spectrum among young people? Do you think we should try to prevent it in favor of more central stances?
Is it my turn to go first, Nate? I lost track. I talked for too much. Okay, I'll jump in and go on this. I think this is the young people that are getting involved in politics, I think is great. Young people are getting more involved in politics now than I think they were when I was in high school, for instance. The one thing that I told the class, because there was a similar question to this when we visited one of the classrooms, the one thing that I said is, as a young person, you absolutely should get involved if there's issues that you're passionate about, and you absolutely can be confident and be passionate about issues that you care about. Just I'll stress it again, and I'll sound like a broken record throughout the night, but I would stress to the young people that want to get involved in politics is to do it in good faith and do it with intellectual curiosity. Be passionate, be confident in your stances, go to protests, go volunteer on campaigns, all of those things, run for office, but do it in a way that when your ideas and your preconceived worldviews are challenged, you react in a way where you want to learn why. And maybe you end up being right because you've learned why that's wrong. Or maybe you realize you didn't understand something fully, or you were wrong on something and your view changes or your policy positions change. And as long as you're going through the world with that intellectual curiosity and that open-mindedness and that willingness to learn, then get involved, be passionate, be confident, all of that. And you can do it as young as you want. And even if you're ignorant to policy positions on certain things, because you'll still learn, because when you're challenged, which you will be, I promise, if you get involved in, go look at my Facebook page every single day, you get challenged if you're in politics, period. But if you approach those challenges with the willingness to learn instead of closing up and just saying they're wrong, they're wrong, they're wrong, la la la, then you're going to learn and you're going to get better and you're going to grow and you're going to do really good things in the community. It's just that the idea of being stubborn about your ideas and digging in, that's the only problem when you get involved in with radical opinions, which is what the question was asking. The only problem with radical opinions is when you're unwilling to learn new information and to pivot your perspective. I have plenty of radical positions. I had more radical positions when I was younger because I'm willing to be open-minded and learn and get more information and then pivot in my thinking. So that's what I would say as far as radical opinions is they can change as long as you're open-minded.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I would say we certainly shouldn't try to prevent, different opinions just because we consider them to be radical. I think, you have radical opinions on either side of the spectrum. And like Jared said, I think the important thing is not necessarily whether we have, radical or more central opinions being discussed, but that the people who hold these opinions, no matter what they are open to, learning new information and, hearing from other people's perspectives and looking at the facts. And so I think that's really the focus, is not necessarily that, we should try to make sure that everybody has a centrist opinion on everything, but the focus should be that people from the left and the right can be open-minded toward one another and be open to thoughtful conversations with one another.
I think that, it's a great point all around. Our next question, what is the value in having respectful conversations with people who think differently from us?
Yeah, really good question. It gets to the crux of probably why we're all here tonight. I think this question does. So I can think of a couple examples of why this is really important, and I'll give one that's in the context of politics. So, let's say at the county council, I have a particular position on something that we're going to be considering voting on, and Jared has maybe the opposite position. Well, I know that I can call Jared and I can, we can agree to disagree, but I can say, hey, tell me more about why you think things should be this way, or, what facts do you have, or what experience do you have that leads you to think that this is important? And he could tell me something and I'll say, I'd never considered that. I hadn't thought about that before. So it's really helpful to have that information. And it's not necessary that always changes, the way that we're going to vote on something, but I think it's always helpful to have that. But I think even more importantly than examples like that is outside of politics. I don't want to live in a society where I'm only hanging out with people who agree with me on all the issues, and my kids are only allowed to hang out with people who they agree with on everything. I think it's really valuable that we're able to have respectful dialogue with people who think differently, because politics is great, but it's not everything. It shouldn't totally dominate our lives and every aspect of our lives to the point where we're only interacting with people who we agree with. I enjoy being able to hang out with people who, maybe are politically on a different side of the spectrum than me. And I think that brings a lot of value, not just to politics, but to my life and to friendships I have and other relationships I have. And so I think it goes beyond politics, why it's so important to be able to have those thoughtful and respectful conversations with people who we might disagree with on various policy issues.
Yeah, and I have a very similar perspective on that. On a personal level, and I do have a policy, specific policy example that I'll give, but just on a personal level, I don't want to live in a world where I can guess every single thing you're going to say and every policy position that you're going to take because I know what party you associate with. I don't want to hang out with somebody that, no matter what we're talking about, because you're a Republican, I can Google Republican policy positions and know exactly down the line what you're going to think and what you're going to say. Not only is that incredibly uninteresting, but I don't think we're going to ever get anything positive out of that as far as policy conversations, government work, community work, even if it's not in politics and government specifically. So on a personal level, I choose to surround myself with people who challenge me all the time. If my wife was listening to this, she'd be laughing right now, because I think one of the reasons that we connected when we connected at 20 years old was because she challenged me and made me feel really stupid in front of all my friends because I was wrong about something. And I just, for the first time in my life, admitted I was wrong. So she's not watching, don't tell her. But the point is that I want to surround myself with people who challenge me, who make me think and rethink different perspectives and different things. That's, I think, how we grow. That's how we evolve as human beings. So on a personal level, I think that's the importance of understanding and conversing with people we have differences with. But on a policy, on a real world example level, and I'll use the example with Nate because Nate is a part of this policy position. I've been working for a year on a really big early learning policy and a major investment. I wanted Snohomish County to be the first county, or the first time at least in Snohomish County, for us to find a dedicated funding source and mechanism for early learning and to try to create an early learning system. And I could talk about that for an hour and I'm not going to, but I'm deeply passionate about investing in early learning and the importance of it. And so I saw this opportunity with some dollars that we had from Sound Transit tax. And I said, I want all of that money to go to early learning, 100% of it to go to early learning. That would take away from other education opportunities like in the K-12 system and in higher ed. And I said, early learning is more important than both of those. Here's why. Da, 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 da. Here's the money that K-12 and higher ed have already gotten based on the legislative policies that were passed over the last 6 years. So I want all of it to go into early learning because it's never been helped and it's the most important. And I was very stubborn about that. And Nate would probably laugh and agree right now that at the beginning, I was very stubborn about that. And Nate responded, and I expected he'd be like, yeah, I've got young kids. I think you're right. And he responded with, well, have you thought about this? This is why I kind of disagree with that 100% of it going there. And I said, I hadn't really thought about that. Instead of just thinking he's a shill for the higher ed community or whatever I would think, I said, Nate's probably got an interesting perspective that I haven't thought through. So I called him and we talked for a little bit about this. He explained why it was important that we follow students all the way through from the early learning phase through K-12 through into higher education, why it's so important that we have money, at least some, set aside to assist students throughout the entire process, and that we don't let them fall through the gap once we finally get them at the beginning. And it really opened my mind. I started to have other conversations with other people from not the early learning world, from the K-12 world, from the higher education world over this last year. And we ended up passing about 3 weeks ago now, this early learning policy where a huge chunk of it went to early learning. I think somewhere around 80% of it ended up going to early learning. But there was money set aside there for K-12. There was money set aside there for higher education for important reasons. And those reasons were written into this policy. And that would not have happened if one, I ruled the world and did everything by myself. And two, if I would have just clammed up and said, Nate's just a Republican that doesn't understand and doesn't care about kids. So I'm just going to go this way. And so that's a real world example of a Republican who I generally would disagree with on a lot of different policies, disagreeing with me on something, and me instead just engaging with him and saying why, and learning and actually understanding why I was wrong. And I do think to this day I was wrong about 100% of it, but needing to be black and white, cut and dry over here. And that was me evolving and learning, and it was him teaching me that. And so that's an example of something that would not have happened if I wasn't open-minded and willing to hear a differing opinion and engage in that.
Thank you both. Our next question comes from Adeze. Hope I pronounced your name correctly. As a person of color, I would find it very important to have representatives who can relate to minority groups in our community. Who in your line of work represents different ethnic and minority groups and can speak for the minority and get their voices shared?
So in Snohomish County, in the county government, we actually have the Office of Social Justice, which is made up of employees of color who work on these issues pretty much exclusively. They all have some other job descriptions, but we have an Office of Social Justice specific to these kinds of issues. And so there's some people of color there, employees of color that I have in this last year leaned on a little bit for some of these issues that I need that other perspective on. Our county council, maybe the person who asked this question knows this, maybe they don't, but the county council right now is all white. We have 2 white women and 3 white men on the county council. And so we don't have a person of color taking votes on the county council. And that's why it's important that we are intentional, again, back to being intentional about kind of making that space and seeking out that perspective, when we're making our decisions. Because if specifically a person of color isn't at the table as far as being on the 5-person council, then that perspective isn't heard unless it's heard by someone else and accepted or really taken to heart by the council and the people that are taking the votes. And so the Office of Social Justice is a group of folks that I like to lean on and talk through, filter through policy ideas when I don't understand what that perspective would look like. And there's also community organizations who are active and involved in local politics, the NAACP, Communities of Color Coalition. They have leaders who are actually pretty active and paying attention to even local politics. It's not all like the super sexy stuff on the federal level or the state level. They recognize that a lot of policies that really impact communities of color are happening at local levels, law enforcement types of things, human services types of things, even environmental types of things. And so oftentimes there'll be testimony from members of those types of organizations And it's the county council's ability to engage with that more and hopefully not let it go one ear out the other. I think our council's done a pretty good job of trying to at least in the short term since I've been on the council. I've noticed that I think our council's done a pretty good job of listening to those perspectives and even seeking them out when they're not brought immediately to certain policies that we think maybe that perspective is important. But that again, sometimes that perspective is lost if it's not on a council member to say, hey, we should really reach out to this organization or this group to get this perspective that we don't have. So I think it's about being intentional as elected officials. If we don't have that perspective, to seek it out. And it's again back to being intellectually curious about things.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I would say, as elected officials, I think it's our responsibility and when we have to be accountable to representing all people, regardless of whether they look like us or not, and trying to make ourselves as accessible as possible and being direct or being what's the word we used earlier, Jared, that I took from you, being
intentional.
That's what I'm looking for. Being intentional about reaching out to groups who we might not otherwise hear from, and I think that just makes it all that much more important. And then, like Jared mentioned, in the executive's office, there's the Office of Social Justice, and actually a really good example is right now. I've been in meetings where the Office of Social Justice has been present with the Marysville School District and is helping with a lot of work going on there. So there are some really good resources available. But again, I'd reiterate, I think as council members, we do have a responsibility and should be held accountable by all residents that we represent to make sure that we're accessible to them.
Thank you. Our next question, I believe, is anonymous. How can we use the media as an information resource without letting it drive us into warring camps of thought, unable to even talk with each other?
Yeah, this is a really good question because we do need to have a way to get the news right and to learn about what's happening in our local communities and at the state and the national level. So it's not like, I don't think it's a great option to just block everything out because it is important we get that information. I think what I would say is it's really tough when I turn on the TV and if I flip to Fox News and then MSNBC and I see opposite, headlines and opposite stories, it really doesn't help me at all. It just creates more confusion, I think, for everybody. And so I think what's probably important here is finding media sources which are as unbiased as possible, which are giving out facts and information as opposed to just opinion. I think a lot of local news sources do a really good job of that, both local newspapers and then like our, your Seattle TV stations, Como and King and Q13 and all of them. I think they do a much better job than what we see at the national level on both the left and the right of providing, just information that can help people to be better informed and then come to their own conclusions about, various issues that are happening in their community. So I think that's really important. And again, just trying to pick out facts from opinion and using those facts to have those conversations with each other.
What to add to that about media and media bias generally is I think a lot of times we're really harsh on media, or at least some politicians are really harsh on media. I know I'm certainly guilty of this sometimes, of being really harsh when there are errors and when there's very clear bias. But I think that as human beings, we all have bias in certain ways, and journalists are no different. It's just as far as consumers, and what I try to highlight, what I try to make clear when I talk about corrections in the media and things like that and biases in the media is there's nothing wrong with watching news or getting primary news from certain biased sources. If I want to turn on CNN and that's going to be what I'm watching to get primary news from, nothing wrong with that. Of course, journalists are trying to do good jobs and dig in on stories and present facts as they see them, etc. Where the problem is when you only get your information from one source and it ends up being a biased source, then you create this kind of worldview about things, and you tend to get, at least I definitely did, I would tend to get much more emotional and upset and angry about stories that I'm hearing. And then I would not just take that one extra step of just kind of Googling that and digging a little bit deeper on that thing before I just make a social media post or concrete a position in my head. And that's, I think, where we get into trouble, is if you're only getting your information from one source and then you're not checking that, and then you're letting it get you emotional and riled up. And that's that's we need to have that recognition of media plays a very important role, a very, very important role in society, in getting information to us. However, media, especially the big media conglomerates, are still motivated by profits. They are still private companies. And so, how do you use human psychology to profit in the media? Well, you get people riled up so they don't want to click off the TV. And that's just natural. That's capitalism at work in media. And so you've got to at least be watching it with that recognition that, are they telling me this because they want to be completely unbiased and factual, or are they saying this because they want me to keep watching? The answer most of the time is that they really want you to keep watching, and it could be truthful information. And most of the time, it is probably truthful information, but it is uh, picked and choose to be information that's going to get you excited. And most of the time, human beings, based on psychology, get more excited about things they're mad about than things they're happy about. And if you don't think that's true, I'll show you my email inbox and my Facebook DMs any day if you want, because people will not message and they don't put the energy in to pull up something and message most of the time to say, hey, I'm really happy about that thing you did. Thanks. It's most of the time it's the opposite. And I think media knows that. They've evolved in that way, and the capitalism at work is fostering that to make money. And so I think that's where we get into trouble, is if we don't verify things and we just take things at face value without understanding bias and how the system is actually working and why it's working.
Thank you both. Our next question is also anonymous. You mentioned the importance of having community leaders and elected officials listen to perspectives from groups who haven't previously had a voice. What do you say to community members, young and old, who have not felt supported and are afraid to speak up with their perspectives and experiences?
It's really hard. I can't, I won't sugarcoat that. It's really difficult to be the sore thumb, the person that sticks out. In one of the classroom visits that we had, I think it actually might have been the professor that said, there was a study done. It might have been in one of the colleges, did a study on, and there's probably a million studies just like this, where you put a line of people, 15 people in a line, and you draw something up on the whiteboard, and it's a small line, and you ask them, is this a small or a big line? And you ask the first person, but you tell the first person to say it's a big line. You tell the second person to say it's a big line. The third person, fourth person, maybe fifth person, they're going to say it's a big line without you even telling them to say it's a big line. When you get to the 10th, 15th person, everyone is going to say that small line is a big line, because that it's very difficult to be the person that steps out of line and says something that's contrary to what all their peers are saying. It's the same reason you see mob mentalities in supermarkets and at Costco and all of these other things. And when you see a video of some altercation or some fight that's happening in public, and you see that posted on YouTube, but there's like 40 people standing around, it's like, why didn't anyone step in and do anything in that period of time? It's because it's really difficult to be the person that stands out, that does something different, and to be contrary. We all, again, going back to that tribalism, we all want to be a part of a group, and we all want to be accepted by our peers. It feels good to be accepted, but it feels good to get a bunch of heart emojis on your posts. It feels bad to get angry emojis on your post. And so you want to do things that you know people are going to like. And that's just natural in human psychology. So it's really hard for me to tell people in the community, especially young people, you should go out and you should say things that are different than what other people are saying, because I know what that means, because I'm in politics and I say things that are contrary to what a lot of people in my own party want me to say oftentimes. And it's not fun in the comments to field some of the negative stuff. And sometimes I'm wrong when I do those things. And that's a part of trying to learn and trying to kind of speak your mind and be open-minded to different perspectives. But it's not easy, and it's not a lot of fun to be the sore thumb that sticks out. And so what I would say to young people or old people, like the question says, that have felt afraid or unsupported, I think that way more people in society in general, but certainly in our community, in my experience, way more people have that perspective of, hey, we should accept different perspectives and we should search them out. Way less people are the really extreme fringes who want to just tear you down no matter what for a differing opinion. And even the people that make those comments on social media or that try to tear you down, most of the time those people don't believe what they're saying. In my experiences, it's because there's other people that are going to watch them say that, and then they're going to gain some, credit in the community for tearing down you and being a troll. And so it's tough, and you have to be brave, and you have to be willing to take some of that heat, which is hard to say, especially hard for me to say to young people. I can't imagine if my son was 11, 12, 13, growing up in this social media age, and him asking me, all of my friends are saying this, but I know that's not true. What should I say? Because I know when he does say that, what's going to come. But it's just really about trying to be brave and understanding that the people, and this is something that it took me a while to learn, and it was really my wife that taught me this in these last couple of years. When you make a social media post, or you make a comment, or you say something publicly that people disagree with, and then people are really trying to tear you down on it, even if those people were people that, in my experience, personal experience, held my son when he was first born, or knew me before I ever met my wife, or knew me before I was ever in elected office, even if that is that person and you thought that person was like your ride or die and they were going to be supporting you forever, even if that person is the one saying those really nasty negative things about you, um, they never really cared about you as a friend and really supported you if that's how they're willing to treat you when you say something that you truly feel. If they knew you and they were your friend and they knew your heart and they know you're not a bad person, they wouldn't be tearing you down in those ways just because you're saying something that they disagree with. And so that's a very hard pill to swallow. It's a very hard thing to say. I don't live by that every day. I'm not perfect. I get offended and I get sad and all those things. But I think it's about trying to be brave and doing the right thing. And the more people that do that, the easier it's going to get for other people in the community to do that, which is a big reason and a big motivation for me to be doing what I'm doing in this town hall and in the classroom visits and in the types of social media posts that I make about, quote unquote, unity and this kind of version of civil discourse that we've been talking about. It's difficult, but I encourage everybody that can and is willing to do it. And I'll certainly be in your corner.
Yeah, and I think it certainly can be really difficult for people who are in situations where they're uncomfortable or don't feel supported in sharing their perspective or experience on things. I mean, I can imagine how intimidating it could be going before a city council or a county council or a school board or giving testimony at the legislature if you hold an opinion that is contrary to what everybody else holds, and maybe you don't feel like they're taking your perspective into consideration. I think that would be really difficult. And I don't know that I have the answer to that. Like Jared said, I think this is a really tough one to wrestle with. Certainly, I think as elected officials, like I said in one of the previous questions, I think we have a responsibility to be receptive to and be accessible to everybody, regardless of whether we agree with their opinion or not, or whether we have a similar background to them or not. But I'd be really interested in hearing if folks on the town hall have ideas on how we can make it easier for people who maybe feel uncomfortable sharing their perspective. What are some things that we can do either as individuals or as a community to make that a little bit easier? So if you have thoughts on that, feel free to type it in the chat. But yeah, I think that's a really difficult one.
Yeah, thank you. So, kind of paraphrasing, but this is another anonymous question. So, how can we reach out to young people to engage them and their peers in political and civil discourse?
I think this is really important. Jared's doing a great job with the Youth Advisory Council. I think that's one way that government can reach out to young people, and I think Claire's doing a great job with the Young Voters Club, and that's how students and schools can reach out to young people. And so I think examples like that, my favorite thing to do as an elected official is to go out into schools and talk with students about local government or common issues that our communities are facing. And so the more we can just raise awareness of this and provide opportunities for young people to share their perspective and to share what's important to them, what their passions are, what issues that you all care about. I think the more opportunities we have to do that, whether it's in the schools or in a government setting or in other settings, the more we can learn and the more we encourage young people to speak up. And so would love to see more of those opportunities and would love to participate in them. It's one of my favorite parts of the job.
A super simple answer is to support students like Claire and programs and clubs like the ones that Claire has started and been interested in, it's so refreshing to see a student who, and there's a lot of students like this that we've encountered, Nate and I, over the last week, and talking to students like Claire, who you are exactly intellectually curious. When I picture that word and when I use that word, that's what I mean by that, is someone who not only do you want to learn other things, but you started a club and you volunteer your free time to basically talk to people you disagree with about really maybe emotionally charged at times politics topics. And we need to support students like that. We need opportunities for students like that who are intellectually curious and want to be active members of the community. We need opportunities like that for young people to engage with each other, but also with their government officials and also with their other community members, because this is an example of a human being that's going to be leading us in the future. When she starts to get involved in government, I'm going to be right there supporting her as much as possible, because this is the type of curious mind that we need in politics. So the young people, the young generation specifically, needs to be, I think, targeted in this type of way, in this civil discourse conversation kind of way. Because if we don't do that intentionally, what's going to end up happening is social media, because they understand it way better than we do, social media is going to continue to do its capitalist work on them, which is to kind of spread them and divide them into these corners, like it has with our society today. But it's going to do it on hyperdrive, because the students are on social media even more. When I was Claire's age, Facebook was just coming out. I don't even know I don't know how old Claire is, so it might not have quite even been out when I was Claire's age. And so it certainly wasn't what it is today. There wasn't Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, whatever that is, and all the other things that there are now, that are continuing to keep our young people's eyes on their phones and in this like social media environment where they think that everyone is right in their community, because they're not. You're getting hate tweets and angry emojis from people, maybe not even in the United States, but certainly on the East Coast, and some people you'll never meet, and that hurts you, and that's hurting them. It's hurt just like it hurts us. And so I think it's important that we do focus on giving young people the opportunities to engage in this kind of discourse and have these types of conversations and to be curious. And I think it's important that our educators, they are promoting intellectual curiosity and searching out differing and unique ideas. I don't think that our teachers necessarily have to be completely 100% unbiased and apolitical. I don't think that's possible to ask of any human being, but I think at least pushing students to read things and to engage with people who they know they disagree with. I think that's so important. And that's why I'm proud of Claire, that she's doing this and want to engage in any of these types of opportunities ever with young people, because this is a message that I think is probably the most important message to get to young people. And that's why that was the motivation behind the youth advisory board that I'm engaged in trying to create right now on the Snohomish County level that Nate was referencing, because I want these platforms and these opportunities for young people to not only, it shouldn't be on Claire to have to do this on her own. She shouldn't have had to reach out to us and say, I want to do this town hall, I like this op-ed. She shouldn't have had to reach out to her, at school admins to create a club that could offer this, space for her to have conversations that challenge her intellectually. She shouldn't have had to do that. Those should have existed. That should have been on us to do. And that's why this youth advisory board is an important concept to me, because I think it is, I feel some of the onus and the responsibility to create this space, much like we're trying to create space for diverse opinions in politics from adults and communities of color and historically marginalized voices. We need to be doing that for youth as well. And so I love that question, and it's something I'll be engaged in as long as I'm in elected office, for sure.
I think this might be our last question, but how do we think we can avoid making assumptions, dealing in absolutes, and dehumanizing people simply based on their political party or beliefs, both in social media and in our own lives?
I don't know whose turn it is, but I can go first here. Really good question. I think I think back to one of the things that Jared said earlier, and if you only remember one thing from tonight, this is probably the thing to remember: is work in good faith with people and assume good intent in others. I think that's the best way to avoid, making absolutes or dehumanizing people based on their political beliefs. Is assume good intent when you're speaking with somebody, whether it's on social media and you see a post or a comment, or whether you're in person having a conversation with somebody about, a political issue. Assume that they're coming from a good place and that their heart's in the right place, and work in good faith with them to have that conversation. I think Jared put it best earlier, and maybe he can re-explain it because I'll do a bad job of remembering it here. But instead of, assuming that someone's your enemy and forcing them to prove that they're a good person and have good intent, do the opposite. Assume that they have good intent, and keep thinking that way until they demonstrate to you that that maybe they have some sort of ill motive. And so I think that's super important in trying to overcome some of these difficulties we face in humanizing people.
No, as always, Nate is more succinct and elegant than I am. So I'm going to leave it at that because that was exactly what I would have said, but in a much longer winded way with more unnecessary words. So yeah, thank you, Nate. That's exactly right. That's it.
So I think you kind of touched this or spoke to this earlier. But what role, if any, should schools play in teaching civil discourse?
Yeah, no, that's pretty much what my response was for that last question, because I think that it's so important for a youth to be learning that. And that's what college to me was. That's what I wanted out of college, and that's also what my parents told me college was supposed to be. That's what I expected out of college, was to be challenged intellectually, to have my worldview uh, turned upside down, and for me to see that there's many more different perspectives on things, like not even necessarily politics and policy things, just real world things, than just mine. Having grown up basically in the same town since I was like 7 years old. I mean, my family bounced around until I was about 7, which is when I landed right here. But other than that, I've lived here my whole life, and I've pretty much been in this pretty well-off white community. I haven't struggled financially too much, but that's been my little bubbled perspective. And I think it's important that you recognize when you go out into the real world that there are so many other perspectives. There's billions of people on this planet, and for every one person, that's one different perspective than you, because nobody has the same life. Not even twin brothers have the same lives. And so I think that's probably something that needs to be taught even earlier than once you get to college, especially since nowadays I think it's being taught a little less in college. I think in our public education system, that K-12 system, that's the place where the new place maybe where we should have students learning how to be curious, how to understand that there's so many other perspectives in the world other than their own, and that they shouldn't be afraid of that. They should want to hear those. They should want to be challenged and learn from those, and they should want to keep growing and evolving as a human being. And so I think that's the biggest responsibility, in my opinion, in the K-12 system, is that math is insanely important, science insanely important, all the rest. But if you leave high school understanding math and science, but not understanding how to have conversations with other human beings that have different perspectives than you, I think we did a massive, massive disservice as a public entity to you. And so I think that's probably the number one focus that we should have in our K-12 system is teaching kids how to learn and how to want to learn, not necessarily specifically teaching them.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think schools probably play a primary role in this. And I think a great example is Mr. Nattersad's class, who we got to spend time with over the last couple of days, his various civics classes. And that was a great example, I think, of just what we're talking about, of encouraging that civic discourse and encouraging, dialogue, even when there's disagreement. I know the students are working on projects, or they will work on projects at some point in the year on a policy issue or a policy recommendation to some sort of government, either local government or state government. And I think that's a great example, giving students open rein to pick an issue that they care about and then dig into it a little bit more and come up with ideas on proposals on how they can change it. And I think, kind of like Jared said, it's important that whether it's schools or families or community leaders. We try to encourage people and encourage young people, how to think and not what to think. It'd be really boring if we all just thought the same thing, or we went to school and we were all told we have to believe this. And I don't know, it'd just be really boring. I think one of the most exciting parts for me about going to high school and then going to college was having my views challenged, like Jared said, and getting to hear from other people who who have different perspectives and get those questions and have those interactions. And so the more our schools can do that, and the more all of us as individuals can encourage that, the better.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think now we'll go into some closing thoughts or remarks.
Well, I just want to thank, we ended up at a peak, I think, hitting around 50 participants. Some people have dropped off, some people have jumped on. But I want to thank everybody for taking the time on an evening to just jump on a Zoom call and hear this discussion and even participate. We had way more questions than we could even get to tonight, which is a really good problem to have. So I want to make sure everyone knows how grateful I am and how inspired that I am to see how many people in the community, are open to this conversation and want to talk about how we can talk to each other better. I hope that this was somewhat helpful and maybe inspired some people to have conversations with friends that aren't here tonight, maybe about this, or to maybe approach conversations with their friends and loved ones, or even strangers differently. And I'm going to continue to do this work and continue to kind of preach this as much as possible. And then lastly, I want to make sure that I thank Claire and make sure that we make her blush with compliments, because she's done an amazing job. This is a high school student who took it upon herself to engage with her elected officials and say, this is a topic that I want the community to hear more about. And so she organized all of this. We've done planning meetings with her. I think she's done a great job balancing the Zoom and the questions that have been incoming. And I'm also just inspired again by what you are taking it upon yourself to do, and the way that your thought process works when it comes to thinking about things. So thank you, Claire, for this. This has been an awesome night and an awesome experience, and it wouldn't have happened without you and your leadership on it. So thank you, and I can't wait till you run for president in like 20 years when you're age eligible.
Yeah, and I just, like Jared, want to thank everybody for coming out this evening. It was so great to have so many people involved and so many great questions. And I know people are really busy. It's a weeknight, and we're all probably sick of Zoom by now. But to have that participation and that engagement was really good. And hopefully it's just the beginning. Hopefully there's more of this moving on into the future. I know both Jared and I are always available. Maybe we can put our emails in the chat here. So if you ever have questions or ideas or thoughts or concerns that you want to share with us, please feel free to reach out. We try to be as accessible as we can and would love to continue this conversation into the future. So please do reach out if you'd like to communicate. And then lastly, a huge thank you to Claire. You just did an incredible job organizing this and moderating everything. I hope you run for office someday, and no matter what you do, you've got a really bright future ahead. So thanks so much for organizing all this, and to everybody who participated.
Yeah, I just thank you both so much. Now, I just give a shout out. I see some of my fellow students and club members here. So hi, Addie, Christopher, and Sylvia, and then my co-founder, Andrew, as well as Mr. Natterstad, who's our club advisor. I just, I'd really say so many people, I would thank all of you and Mr. Strickland and Miss Lagore because really it's just people have, gotten a platform to do these things and just, ask me if I wanted to participate. So, yeah, thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone who came. I really enjoyed this discussion and, kind of, I guess, reiterating all that has been said tonight. I think it's just such an important conversation moving forward. And, as I guess, speak more specifically to my generation at this point, like, we're looking forward, making, this intentional effort to separate people and ideas, like the councilman said, and see the human. Yeah, thank you all.
Have a good night, everybody.